Bible. And today we're going to be looking at the question, did Moses write the Torah? Okay, so that's what we're going to be looking at today. So let's start off with this. What is the Torah? First five books of the Bible, that's right. It's also known as the Pentateuch, which means 5 books. Okay? So it's the first 5 books of the Old Testament, okay? And let's just kind of go through them really quick. We have the book of Genesis. It's the book of beginnings. Genesis means origin or birth or generation or beginning. We see a covenant is made with Abraham. And the book chronicles creation and the earliest history of humanity, culminating in the patriarchal narratives of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. We have the book of Exodus. This is where we see the departure. God reveals himself really to his own people, but not just that, but also to the Egyptians and to the rest of the world through what he does in Egypt. He sets his people free from bondage in Egypt. The people come up out, they exodus. We see a covenant made between Moses and Israel and at Mount Sinai, where Moses goes up and he talks with God and he receives the 10 Commandments and really all the law of God that's considered the old law or the Mosaic law. We have the book of Leviticus from Levi, the priestly tribe. This is God's guidebook for teaching his people about holy living and worship under the Mosaic law. The book focuses on holiness standards, sacrificial regulations, rituals, and priestly duties. We have the book of Numbers in the wilderness. It records Israel's experiences while journeying through the wilderness. The people's disobedience, their lack of faith, it causes them to wander for 40 years. The book describes their wanderings, the census data, the key events that lead them up to reaching the promised land. And we have the book of Deuteronomy, also known as the second law. Okay, it's written when God's people were about to enter the promised land. It reminds the reader that God is worthy of worship and obedience. And the book includes a series of sermons or restatements of God's word, of God's law, and legal reiterations given by Moses, reaffirming Israel's covenant with God before Israel enters the promised land. Okay? So those are the kind of like a very brief overview of those 5 books. Now, there's a big dilemma when it comes to the Torah, because a lot of people like to discredit the idea that it was written in the time that it claims to be written in. One of the most popular errors, I would say, in the last century is the idea that almost none of the Old Testament was written down before the Babylonian captivity around 600 BC. Historians will tell you that, scholars will report that. It is widely theorized that upon arriving in Babylon, well-meaning Jews decided to create a history to unify Jewish captives. They found creation and flood stories of great antiquity, and they altered these myths, incorporating their own Jewish oral traditions and the idea of monotheism. And the finished product of that, scholars and historians will say, was Genesis. Now, what does that do if that's true? What's the end result if that's a true claim that they're making? Yeah, it wouldn't be accurate at all. As a matter of fact, it would be a lie. It would regulate all of Genesis to just myth and folklore and legend. Worse even still, not even original. It's been stolen and plagiarized and kind of just a couple things tweaked about it and then re-put back out there. Right? That's a good point. That is a good point. And actually, kind of piggybacking on that, Jesus quoted Genesis as literal history. So here's the thing. It doesn't just discredit Genesis. And it doesn't just discredit the Old Testament. If you discredit Genesis, you discredit everything. You discredit the entire Christian faith. You discredit the entire Bible. You discredit God. Because here's the point. Jesus talked about Genesis as it was literal history. He quoted from it as events that actually happened. So if it didn't happen, that makes Jesus a liar and a fraud, doesn't it? It would have to be, right? So to discredit Genesis, you really discredit everything. And that's an important thing, because I think there's a lot of Christians that have they've bought into this lie that they can somehow marry anti-God bias beliefs with their biblical beliefs, and they can kind of say, well, Genesis is not important to the faith. We don't really need to take all that serious. We don't need to take it all literal, because really what matters is the New Testament. That's not true. If you can throw away Genesis, you can just throw away the whole Bible. That's the reality of it. And so we need to be clear about this. Genesis is true, and it's factual, and it's accurate. And I would also point out that the theory that's being made there, when those claims are made, there is no evidence at all that is ever used to show that the Babylonian stories came first. That's just assumed. That's a presupposition that, well, Babylon's so ancient, their stories had to come first, and then the Bible stories came later. There's no evidence for that. That is completely speculation. So why can't I speculate the total opposite? I can, and I do. I suggest to you that the Bible stories came first, and the Babylon stories piggybacked off of it, because everyone descended from Noah. So everyone has those early accounts, and they take these accounts with them. Yeah, but this is what they teach in college. And I tell you, there's a lot of Christians that will go away to college and they'll start taking classes on this ancient literature or ancient history. And very quickly, because they've never studied on these topics, their faith is rocked by it. Because they're only getting that one side. And hey, it's coming from a professor, so they must know what they're talking about. But again, that's why these things are very important to talk about, because you need to know how to refute those false ideas and those false assumptions. And then sadly, many Christians, they have accepted that nothing biblical was recorded prior to Moses. Now stop and think about that. Is that something that you've maybe considered? Or something that you've maybe thought, well, if Moses wrote Genesis, then I guess nothing was recorded before Moses. Right? And over the years, I've heard deacons teach this. I've heard preachers talk about it. I think I've even heard a couple elders comment on this and make this comment that this idea that oral tradition was used as the method by which Moses and the ancient Hebrews knew God prior to Moses writing everything down at the time of Moses. And I'm just going to suggest to you that that's false. That's not true at all. Let's talk a little bit about the oral tradition theory, because that's exactly what it is. It was popularized by men known as Hermann Gunkel and Julius Wellhausen. They were atheist scholars, and they believed that Genesis was just evolved Babylonian legends. And so they came up with this theory to back up their own anti-God bias. That's where the idea came from. They were coming up with an idea, well, how do we account for these ancient books? Well, we're going to create this theory that it actually piggybacked off of the Babylonian myths. And at best, it suggests Moses received oral tradition passed down for thousands of years. Now stop and think about that. Can we trust something if it's just oral tradition passed down for thousands of years?
Certainly not only that, but I guess.
But even with direct revelation, to think nothing was written down at all for 2,000 years? Yeah, exactly. And that idea is where a lot of the discredit comes from. We can't trust it because if it was just passed down orally for thousands of years, well then, people embellish, people make things up, things get, repeated wrong. So this idea is out there when you study this subject. And so there's something known as form criticism. Form criticism. And it's the idea that scholars will say that what we're going to do is we're going to try to trace back the roots of the biblical text to the point of oral tradition. And then we'll find out where that fabrication came from. We'll find out where that oral tradition started. But all of that starts off on a presupposition that the Bible's false. None of that is taking into account divine inspiration. None of it is taking into account that anything was written down in the time it says it was written down in. So you're starting off from a false presupposition that this isn't real, that this isn't true. And you're just trying to find ways to make sense of it. So, and this leads to what's known as the documentary hypothesis. Some of you have maybe seen this before if you've studied the subject. This is a secular framework that is used by scholars for understanding the composition of the Pentateuch. It gives 4 hypothesized sources for the Torah. It claims that the first source would have been during the time of Solomon. That's the first part of the Old Testament was actually recorded during Solomon's lifetime, and then the southern kingdom that came after that around 1000 BC. And then there were parts added to it during the time of Isaiah, and the northern kingdom attributed to this in the 900 to 800 BC. And then you have the time of King Hosea, legal reforms, moral reforms around 700 to 500 BC. And then during the Babylonian Empire, the Babylonian exile, 600 to 400 BC. And so the scholars will suggest to you, and this is what you'll hear them hypothesize, that this is where the Old Testament came from. That nothing was recorded before 1000 BC, and everything was just kind of pieced together and added on, and those were the influences. And now, actually, this is old, an old way of thinking. More modern scholars have even pushed the date up more. Some claim that the Old Testament wasn't recorded until 450 to 350 BC, and then some claim that it wasn't even recorded until around 300 to 164 BC. Okay? They keep pushing the date forward. Now, why do you think that is, or at least in part? Puts in more doubt. They're also trying to take into account all the things in Scripture that are prophesied. There's all these things that are written long before they actually happen, and then they come true. Well, how can that be? Well, clearly, they couldn't have been written until those events happened, and then they can say, oh, well, yeah, this was an old prophecy. Again, it's totally not taking into account of divine inspiration, of prophecy even being a potential, because these ideas come from people that don't believe in God. They don't believe that there is such a thing as prophecy. So how could you possibly have such a thing, right? And I'll also point out that these theories that we're talking about here, that these are proposed at a time when historians still believed that nothing was written before the time of Moses. That at all. Like, this was before we found a lot of those ancient documents that we talked about last week. Yes?
They thought that this was the beginning of written language was Moses.
Yeah, because we had not discovered a lot of the things that we've since discovered. And so the thing is, we just have an incomplete understanding of history because, sometimes we don't realize something exists until we dig it up and find it. And we can verify it. But we have found so much through archaeology that keeps pushing the date back farther in recorded writings that we now have. But to Jeff's point, a couple hundred years ago, historians didn't believe that was even possible. So it just goes to show you the incomplete understanding man has, even the experts. Okay? And again, the idea behind this, it all goes back to evolutionary theory. The idea that everything starts off simple in its most purest form, it's incomplete or raw, and then over time it develops into something more complex. Everything gets tied back into the idea of evolution because it is the answer for how do you get this without God. Okay? And so a lot of these ideas come up from the idea of thinking, well, how do I make sense absent the notion of God? How do I rationalize these things? Well, how do we address this? Well, I would point out, starting off, that nothing in the book of Genesis asserts that oral transmission played a role. There's nothing in the book of Genesis that you will read that asserts that things were passed down orally and that's all that it was. So there's no evidence internally for that. And this theory originated before experts knew of the ancient writings from prior to Moses' time. And it's first proposed by non-believers who sought an evolutionary explanation for the Old Testament. Those are very key points that if you're talking to someone about this, you should remind them of, you should bring up. Yeah, if someone asks you, do you believe in caveman, the proper response is, sure, I believe some humans lived in caves. Lot lived in a cave for a while. He was a caveman, but that... That's right. That's right. So what does the internal evidence show? The Bible is clear that Moses wrote Exodus through Deuteronomy. Let's look at some passages that just point this out. Exodus 17:14 says, the Lord said to Moses, write this on a scroll as something to be remembered. Make sure that Joshua hears it. Exodus 24:4, Moses then wrote down everything the Lord had said. Exodus 34:27, the Lord said to Moses, write down these words, for in accordance with these words I have made a covenant with you and with Israel. Numbers 33:2, at the Lord's command, Moses recorded the stages in their journey. This is their journey by stages, and it goes on to cite them. Deuteronomy 31:9, so Moses wrote down this law and gave it to the Levitical priests who carried the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord and to all the elders of Israel. Deuteronomy 31:22, so Moses wrote down this song that day and taught it to the Israelites. I mean, the Bible makes it over, makes the point over and over again. They were writing things down as they went. Okay, contemporary with the events that are happening. How about this? Deuteronomy 31:24, Moses finished writing in a book the words of this law from beginning to end. Joshua 8:31, as Moses, the servant of the Lord, has commanded the Israelites, he built it according to what is written in the book of the law of Moses. So even in the Old Testament, even during the time of Joshua, it's being referred to as the book of Moses. Moses wrote it. He was the author. Okay? Mark 12:26. Now about the dead rising. Have you not read in the book of Moses? So New Testament and Old Testament alike refer to the Torah as authored by Moses. And Jesus agrees by implying Mosaic authorship. In Luke 24:27, it says, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. In Luke 24:44, he said to them, this is what I told you while I was still with you. Everything must be fulfilled that is written about me in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms. So Jesus also attributes Moses as being the writer here. In Joshua 1:7, here we see internal evidence that Joshua had it. He had the book. Okay? So Joshua is contemporary with Moses and outlives Moses because he's the next leader of the Israelites, right? And he already has the book. God says to him, look, be careful to obey all the law my servant Moses gave you. Do not turn from it to the right or to the left, that you may be successful wherever you go. Keep this book of the law always on your lips. Meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do everything written in it. Then you will be prosperous and successful. So he had it. As a matter of fact, Joshua is the only person to have added to the Torah, to the books. We know that from Joshua 24:26. It says, Joshua recorded these things in the book of the law of God. Then he took a large stone and set it up there under the oak near the holy place of the Lord. So the only person that added anything was Joshua. Okay? So that's important to know. Now, the Bible never claims that Moses wrote Genesis. Have you guys ever stopped and thought about that? It does claim he's responsible for it, but it doesn't claim he wrote it. Yeah, so the Bible claims Moses is an eyewitness author, right? But Moses couldn't have been an eyewitness to Genesis, could he have? He's born after Genesis is finished. It's also worth noting that when Moses received direct revelation to write something down, as a general rule, he put it in Scripture that God was telling him to do that. We've already looked at several passages that verify that, but there's nowhere in Scripture where that's noted about Genesis. So I think that's an interesting point. I do. And so what does this leave us? There's no such claim that Moses wrote Genesis, and Moses never states that God told him to write Genesis. So what are we left with here? There's three possibilities to this. The first one is that Moses received an oral tradition that was passed down to him. We've already looked at this. I think that's the weakest of all the positions, and I don't think the evidence is there to support that. The next option would be that Moses received direct revelation from God. Certainly he did, because he spoke with God. Okay? There's also another option, and that's that written records were passed down to Moses, and Moses served as a compiler and editor of those notes. You might say, like, the Bible never comes out and says that. That's true. The Bible also never comes out and says that Moses received direct revelation from God about Genesis. So either way, it's a speculation. But those are the three only possibilities that we have. Yeah, true. But compiling material is also considered authoring it.
But we do have, God did do that.
Yes. We also know that inspired writers sometimes compiled information as part of their inspired writings. So, as just a point that this is actually a normal practice. This isn't novel to just this one claim. In Luke 1:1-4, it says, "Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who, from the first, were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you." Now, Luke's an inspired author. The book of Luke is inspired writing. Luke's attributed to the authorship, but the accounts that are in Luke are not his eyewitness accounts. They're a collection of all the eyewitness accounts he collected, compiled, edited, and put together. That's inspired. So it does still count as inspiration, even if you're compiling older data. And that's an important point, okay? Other places we see this in Scripture. Proverbs 25:1. These are more Proverbs of Solomon, compiled by the men of Hezekiah, king of Judah. Not put together by Solomon himself, compiled by someone else later. Proverbs 31. The sayings of Agur, son of Jacob, an inspired utterance. Proverbs 31:1. The sayings of King Lemuel, an inspired utterance his mother taught him. Right? So we have biblical precedent for that, for there to be material that is compiled and recorded as part of an inspired way that God reveals His Word to us. And these writings all attest to the great accuracy based on eyewitness recordings, though the author was not necessarily the eyewitness himself. And so, again, this validates Moses as a proper author for Genesis, even though he wasn't there to see it firsthand, because he's getting direct revelation from God, and also I'm going to suggest to you that he's also compiling data that's already been recorded. And also consider Moses did have direct communication with God. Exodus 33:1, the Lord would speak to Moses face to face as one speaks to a friend. Okay? How about Numbers 11:25? The Lord came down in the cloud and spoke with him, and he took some of the power of the Spirit that was on him, meaning Moses, and put it on the 70 elders. When the Spirit rested on them, they prophesied. They didn't do it again, though. However, in verse 26, it says 2 men. These men were not there with the rest of them, and the Spirit also came on them, and they prophesied in the camp. So it seems like even though the 70 as a whole only prophesied the one time to show that God's Spirit was with them, 2 of the men kept prophesying. As a matter of fact, later on in verse 29, we see that there's this little exchange where it's like, Moses, why don't you stop them? They're prophesying. And Moses, his response to that in verse 29 is, are you jealous for my sake? I wish that all the Lord's people were prophets and that the Lord would put His Spirit on them. So Moses wasn't jealous that other people was given the Spirit. He wanted all Israel to have the Spirit because, of course, the goal is closeness with God. In Numbers 12:1, Miriam and Aaron began to talk against Moses because of his Cushite wife, for he had married a Cushite. Has the Lord spoken only through Moses, they asked. Hasn't He also spoken through us? Of course, they're rebuked for that because they almost say that in boast as a way of getting on Moses. But the point is, God spoke not just to Moses. He spoke to several people. He spoke to elected, chosen people within Israel. Okay? So I just think that these things are worth mentioning before we go on. Now let's consider some historical evidence to back up this claim. In 1923, there's a man named Commodore P.J. Wiseman. I don't know if any of you have ever read about him or heard about him. Him with Sir Leonard Woolley, they begin excavating ancient Babylonia. Okay? They find ziggurats. They find all these cuneiform tablets, these clay tablets from the oldest measures of antiquity. We looked at some of that last week when we were looking at all those ancient tablets that come way back, that date back to the time around Tower of Babel and then the years that followed, right? So they find these things. So this is 1920s. They're unearthing these things. They're finding these things. They're starting to study these tablets and read them. And they start to have a better understanding of ancient writing styles that until then we just didn't know about. We just assumed that writing's the way we write today. But the ancients, they wrote in different formats. And as this P.J. Wiseman, as he studied these ancient texts, he noticed that they bear a lot of similarity with Genesis. And because we hadn't found those tablets until that time, no one had put these two things together. And so this creates what's known as the Wiseman hypothesis. It's also known as the tablet theory. And we're going to go over some evidence for this because I think it's quite compelling. Unlike modern writing methods that record title and author at the beginning of the book, the ancients put those things at the end. It's known as a colophon. It's kind of the way we look as a postscript, okay? So if you imagine at the end, you might put a little postscript on a letter. That's where they would put the author, and that's where they would put that information. They would put it at the end, not at the beginning. And a colophon contains several bits of information. It would include the title, which would be the first line of the work. It included the author or owner of the tablet, and occasionally the date of writing, although that's not a guarantee. But this is really important. When we look at ancient tablets from the earliest of times, the title of the book was just the first few words of the book. They were not very original with their titles. They didn't try to put a fancy title on their books. So if the book was in the beginning, then the book was named in the beginning. Okay? That's just the first line of the book or the first few important words. That was the title of that book. Okay, that clay tablet. And the author or owner would be put at the bottom of the tablet. And if you had multiple tablets to a book, which often was the case, then you'd have these catch lines where the last line of one tablet would be the first line of the next tablet. That way you could keep the tablets in order. So regardless of whether they were spread out or whether they were misplaced, you could say, oh, okay, this is the way that we read this because there's the last line of one tablet is the first line of the next tablet. So you get a little bit of repetition, but it makes sure that you can always read them in the proper order because you're doing it from tablet to tablet, okay? They didn't have books the way we do today. We're very lucky, okay? But it's important that we understand these things. And when you look at the account of Genesis, what you find is that the ancient account of Genesis actually has these notations. It has these markings in the text. And so let's kind of look through this because, again, this is an alternative theory that goes against the secular theory. This actually validates the Bible as being authentic and ancient. Okay? So let's look at some of this. The recurring phrase, these are the generations. This occurs over and over throughout Genesis. Genesis 5:1, this is the written account of Adam's family line. Genesis 6:9, this is the account of Noah and his family. Genesis 11:10, this is the account of Shem's family line. Genesis 25:19, this is the account of the family line of Abraham's son Isaac. Genesis 37:2, this is the account of Jacob's family line. So over and over again, we see this here, indicating that these could be colophons. That these could be marking who the author or who the owner of that tablet was, who it pertained to. Okay? If understood as a colophon, then these statements make a lot more sense. And if these are colophons, then that means Genesis would have been recorded originally on a series of clay tablets. Okay? Not just passed on as oral tradition. I'll also point out, this is especially true for Genesis 5:1. This is the written account of Adam's family line. Does anyone here read from the King James Bible or the New King James? What does it say there in Genesis 5:1? How does it read?
It says, this is the book of Enoch.
Got it. This is the book of the generations of Adam. It was recorded. It was written down. It wasn't just oral tradition. This is the book of Adam's genealogy. So, food for thought on that. Additionally, there may be also evidence of catch lines in other passages of Genesis. For instance, Genesis 5:32, we have this statement about Noah and his 3 sons. It gets repeated again in Genesis 6:10. It's repetitive for us because we're reading it on pages in a book binded this way. But if these were written on ancient clay tablets, that makes a lot more sense. There's going to be some repetition if we're going from tablet to tablet, but it's all pertaining to the same subject. Again, Genesis 11:26, we have this here, this line gets repeated in the very next verse. Why would that be the case? Because they're on different tablets. The last line of one is the first line of the next. So, all right, these repetitions make more sense if the idea is that they're recorded on different tablets. Let's look at some other evidence that backs up this theory. Genesis 10:19. This was written prior to Sodom and Gomorrah's destruction. How do we know that? How do we know that this was written prior to Sodom and Gomorrah being destroyed? Yeah, it's using the cities as landmarks, as places that are there. It's not written as in these are the ruins. Right? If they're written hundreds and hundreds of years later, it wouldn't make sense to do this. Those places wouldn't exist anymore. Arguably, people wouldn't even know where the city started or ended. So, there's also this passage here in Genesis 10:6, talking about the sons of Ham. Now, if you're reading from the NIV or some modern translations, it says Egypt there, but actually if you read from the New King James or the King James, it says Mizraim. Mizraim is the most ancient way to say Egypt. Why is that? Well, yes, that's what it says in the documents, but more to the point, Mizraim's the one who creates Egypt. He's the one who goes to the land of Egypt and makes the Egyptians. Right? Everyone spreads out from Noah. Who was it that went to the area of Egypt? It was Mizraim. So Egypt comes out of his descendants. So why would the Bible refer to Mizraim and not Egypt? Because it was an ancient text. It was already written. In Genesis 14, we have a lot of this as a way of example. We have over and over again, we have clarifications in the text. Right? So we have something mentioned, and then in parentheses, that is Zorah. In verse 7, there's this place mentioned, and that is Kadesh. In verse 15, this area here, which is north of Damascus. Why have the clarifications? It would make sense to do that if this was an ancient tablet that's being compiled and edited for modern readers, because people don't necessarily recognize the ancient landmarks. So you have clarification. That's where this area is today. Right? So these are all lines of evidence that show that Genesis wasn't just written down for the first time during the life of Moses, but rather ancient tablets are being compiled and edited and put together by Moses from these events. Another example, 14:17, right? There's this valley mentioned, but then that is the King's Valley, right? Because it has a different name when Moses is compiling it. At least that's the theory, okay? There's also this here, I don't know if you know this, Egyptian words and terms start appearing in Genesis, scattered about, after Genesis 37. Now, why would that be? What happens in Genesis 37? That's when you start to see Joseph on the scene. And Joseph lives in Egypt, right? And then after Joseph, what's the next major figure that we are introduced to? After Joseph, who's the next major figure we're introduced to? Moses, right? And where was Moses raised? Egypt, right? So isn't it fascinating that after Genesis 37, sporadically we start to see Egyptian terms or Egyptian words in the ancient Hebrew being used? Why would that be? Because people that were intimately familiar with Egyptian in the time of their lives are writing these things down, right? So just as a way of example, in Genesis 39:1, the spelling of Potiphar is the Egyptian way. In Genesis 41:43, there's an Egyptian word there that gets used for make way or bow the knee. In Genesis 50 verse 3, there's talk of the mummification process 40 days to embalm, 70 to complete the mummification process. That's exactly accurate to how they did it according to Egyptian records. So if this wasn't recorded until 1,000 years later by Jews in Babylon, how could they possibly get that right? Right? They wouldn't know. But if this was recorded during the lifespan of the people, well, they knew how the Egyptians did it because they lived in Egypt. Right? So again, these things all point to an ancient authorship for Genesis. Exodus 1:16, the word Oben's used. And this means birth stools or two stones, which was a method that the Egyptians used for their birthing practice. Again, not something that Jews in Babylon centuries and centuries later would have any knowledge of. But it would make sense to know that kind of intimate information if you lived during the time that it was written. So all of this reflects a writer with intimate knowledge of Egyptian culture, not someone writing this down thousands and thousands or hundreds and hundreds of years later. Okay? Then there's also the names of the books. So these are, I don't know if you know this either. The Hebrews have a different word, their name, for the 5 first books of the Bible. So this is the Hebrew word for those books of the Bible. And then to the right, I put the books, the names we use for them today. Okay? And it's very interesting because when you look at the Hebrew names for the Torah books, every one of the names is the first few words of the book itself. Just like those ancient clay tablets were. Indicating that we're talking about ancient authorship. The same methods, the same practices that's being used, even in the titles of the first 5 books of the Bible, are how the most ancient of ancient people recorded their books. So, isn't that fascinating? I find that to be really compelling. And so all of these are lines of evidence that when you put it all together, you start to get this idea that this isn't just like kind of a crazy wild theory. This is evidence that Genesis was ancient in its origins. And so the history recorded in Genesis always points backward from the subject. Another important point, no instance where it could have been recorded by a person with firsthand knowledge, except for the creation account in Genesis. And let me just wrap up here with this, because I'm not going to get through all the material today. If you've ever wondered why we have 2 different Genesis accounts, we have Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, it could be the case that Genesis 1 is by divine inspiration written down by Moses, and Genesis 2 was recorded by Adam. That would make sense for that.
Hey there, it's Muccigrosso with Shively Church of Christ. Thanks so much for listening. If you liked the video, hit the like button. If you'd like to see more videos like this, hit the subscribe button. Feel free to leave a comment below. We do read those and respond to them. Have a great day.